Hello. We've been discussing the theological background of Eucharist, what it means for the Spirit to transform these elements, and that it's really important to trace the pneumatological aspects and power. Now, something that we've focused a little bit less on is the sign part, that a sacrament is an outward sign that communicates that inward grace. So we've been focusing on that inward component, but the sign can really impact our spiritual experience, our relationship to the sacrament. A sign is tangible, there's something concrete about it, and it's almost like an icon that serves as a portal through which we get to focus our attention and meditate on God. So how much does the sign itself matter, right? If it's all about what God is doing through it, does the actual vessel make an impact or affect its efficacy? So in terms of baptism, we had asked ourselves, what must we replicate from the biblical tradition? For example, we pretty much determined, well, Jesus was baptized in a river, but we don't have to be baptized in a river. What matters is retaining the sign of water in some capacity. So with Eucharist, we have to ask ourselves, what is essential? What are the basic ingredients that we have to keep over for Eucharist to really remain Eucharist? So one of the major aspects is the host, the bread. And it almost sounds strange to even have a debate about this, but we have to ask ourselves, what is it about the bread that makes it so important? Is it about some sort of breadiness, its actual physical contents, how it's baked? Is it what bread represents? So for example, bread for many cultures is a very basic, common, accessible staple in people's diets, right? There's nothing fancy or pretentious or rare or exclusive about the bread. There's something really beautiful about this idea that God can work through the ordinary elements of our communities. And that bread is not something that just grows naturally. It is this composite collaborative effort between the earth and the products, but then also human effort, human hands being able to kind of grind and kind of put together the concoction. So is what matters this idea of its ordinariness and its almost ubiquity in people's homes. So if that's the case, if that's what makes it so powerful, so meaningful, perhaps when Christian missionaries introduce Christianity to places like Japan that are going to have more of a rice-based diet, is rice bread an authentic, faithful option? Is that communicating the same essence of bread in a Mediterranean or European community? Is it still keeping some sort of bread character that would allow for it to do the spiritual work that we expect it to do? Now, what is interesting, especially when transubstantiation is essential in Roman identity, there is the kind of official policy that transubstantiation can't take place unless there's gluten. So it's very interesting conclusion. Some implications of that: you really can't have a truly gluten-free option. So rice, right, is gluten-free. So rice bread seems that it might not actually theologically, liturgically work. So those are big faith questions. For many of you, you probably have seen in church what poses as a gluten-free option. If you go to a Protestant church, they might actually be gluten-free. For Roman Catholics, it's gluten reduced, significantly reduced, but there is a trace amount of gluten inside the wafer. This is interesting for someone who might have an allergy. What does that feel like for that person to have this ultimate sign of God's love and sacrifice, and something that's supposed to be a source of blessing is something that could make you sick? It might just give you a different feel. Now, I highly doubt anyone who's allergic is going to have a severe reaction to gluten reduced, but it would be in those extraordinary cases where there is that sensitivity. Now, that person is not without other options. So the person could totally abstain from the bread, and that is fine. That just drinking the drink, we're promised that we receive the full spiritual elements from just consuming one of the elements, one of the consecrated elements. Some other questions about the composition of the bread. Does it have to be leaven or unleavened? So many Protestant traditions might offer leavened bread. For multiple reasons, this might cause spiritual anxiety for someone who's Roman Catholic. Imagine a priest holding a loaf of bread and breaking it in half, crumbs flying everywhere. With transubstantiation, those crumbs would be a really risky business. And so unleavened bread certainly reduces that issue. And unleavened bread also brings back a lot of the symbolism of Pesach, Passover, so that Jesus would have been celebrating Passover leading up to his crucifixion. So are we called to imitate Jewish practices like the manna in the desert after the Hebrews' liberation from Pharaoh? So should we use matzah, right? Or some other kind of form? So we also have to think about the drink, the beverage. Now, we know it's wine in the Bible, but does it always have to be wine? What is it about that drink that is so significant? Is what matters the grapiness, right? The grape aspect, that it comes from the vine, and we have a lot of vine metaphors in the Bible. So is grape juice a faithful option? There are many Protestant churches who use both wine and grape juice, and there's actually a couple denominations that exclusively use grape juice. One of the most famous is United Methodist. That really grew out of a movement in the early 1900s where there was an epidemic in the congregation. So it was a response to a pastoral issue where there were just more rampant levels of spousal abuse, and a lot of it was attributed to alcoholism. So in order to attend to these families that are falling apart in part because of alcohol, it felt strange to then kind of hold up this sign, this symbol, to hold up actual alcohol in their faces, almost like this flaunting of, here's something that's supposed to spiritually make you stronger, but it's actually making you weaker, right? You have a disease. So some people really found that grape juice still feels in the spirit, without the spirits, of what the Bible is trying to convey. And not only does it keep that grape component, but grape juice can be this deep red color. And after all, it's supposed to be something that becomes blood or reminds us of blood. And so the readiness helps us get into that mindset. So color is another interesting component. So even for Roman Catholics, okay, Roman Catholics will insist that in order for the spirit to be present, there has to be spirits, right? That's kind of like the cheeky one-liner. So there's the insistence that it is alcoholic grape juice. So now, does the color matter? Is that dictated to us as well? Does it have to be red in order to conjure up images of blood, or can it be white? Is white a faithful option? So in class, people shared reasons why someone might prefer red, why someone might prefer white, and that there might be theological and or logistical reasons. So red wine, I mean, for my personal piety, I prefer the red color because I like to think about that aspect of the symbol. But I get why someone's going to want white. I mean, hey, for the altar guild, the ministry who kind of cleans up these liturgical linens, right? The altar cloth, red wine stains. It's like, this is a practical issue. Like, white wine is easier to care for when we're dealing with like expensive fabric. And that can be just it. Jesus said wine. It doesn't actually say in the Bible if it was red or white. So it just says wine. That's what we follow. That's what we imitate. Other things to consider, not just the contents, but the container. The container can affect our relationship to the symbol. I remember the first time I went to a Eucharist and the chalice was made of glass. And I thought that was so cool because I could see, right? There's that transparency. I could reflect on the red color. I could focus on what is in the chalice, really focus on the contents and what it's about to become or what it is, rather than the vessel. I think a lot of us in class said the most common chalice we've witnessed is anything that's quite ornate, opaque, a precious metal, whether it's, I don't know, engraved or bejeweled. And there's something about that type of precious goblet that feels befitting of the precious contents, that you have a regal chalice and Christ is royalty and we care about what's inside. So we ought to also really, really value the chalice. So there's a sense to that. Now, I've also seen churches that use ceramics, so pottery. So is someone trying to say, oh, I'm going to use a cheap material because what's inside is cheap? No, that's not their logic. We're now shifting into a different system where maybe it's more likely Jesus used pottery. There's something earthy, something natural, something kind of humble that feels like, the dish set that Jesus would have used. Someone might use like a wooden chalice that's been sealed. So that feels like befitting of a carpenter. We tried to push the boundaries, does the chalice even actually matter? Does it actually matter? And on the one hand, some of our kind of impulses was to say, no, it's all about Jesus. Jesus is Jesus is Jesus. And then some people are like, maybe I wouldn't want it in this type of cup, right? I wouldn't want it in a plastic Elsa cup. That's right. That's going to feel a little sacrilegious. But then what of other plastic cups? That doesn't feel as formal. Ecologically, it sends a message. But then we thought about our environment in general. What if a priest is using a plastic cup because he's bringing a bunch of a mission group on a camping excursion, right? You're in the woods, you're in nature, you're reflecting on God in God's natural cathedral. Maybe a plastic cup in that setting is okay, but then maybe not in another setting. So just the symbol changes, not just for what it is, but it could be the same in different places. And because it's in a different place, that affects the outcome, the affect. And it's not just what the chalice is made of, but sometimes it's also a question of how many. The Bible says one cup, right? One cup, one bread, one body, one Lord of all. So is the oneness something to preserve? Should we really just have a single chalice is this ultimate exercise in sharing, right? Communal sharing and patience, where we wait for an entire congregation to go up to one cup. Almost the inertia, or right, kind of like the frustration of how long that could possibly take, could almost be the point in of itself, where you have this visceral, like, wow, the church is actually really big. Wow, there's a lot of people in Jesus's family, that you get to really see one by one. God is in that person, and then God is in that person, and God is in that person. So there can be something really beautiful in that gesture. Now, most churches, Catholic, Protestant, whatever, are going to have multiple chalices, just because you need to get through all the groups of people. You need to have, like, we deploy Eucharistic ministers to the wings, to the corners. We do mind the time. And at the end of the day, multiple chalices doesn't defeat the reality that it's still the one Jesus, the one body that's contained within. It's still united. So the way unity is accomplished can be through a lot of different methods. I remember one time when I visited a Baptist church, and it was the first time I had ever seen communion done this way, where the drink was pretty much divided into a bunch of mini shot glasses, and there was a very formal, like, wooden tray with holes so none of the glasses would shift around or knock into each other. And then each congregation member would approach the table, receive one of these mini glasses, go back to her pew and wait. And it's not until everyone is served that in a single liturgical gesture, people drink, right? So that simultaneous action is what makes them feel unified, that there's something that feels really almost polite even, to wait until everyone has it available. And that kind of crosses over with some of our, dining sensibilities. If you're at a restaurant, don't eat until everyone receives their meal. So that waiting, that it's truly a communal experience and not just you and God receiving. So it's interesting. It's interesting. Both ways communicate unity, but they go about it different ways. Now, some other aspects to the ritual, some of the spiritual things that we should consider before receiving can be found through our biblical text, right? We look to the Bible for guidance. So who may partake? Now, there's a huge question of, when do sacraments require pre-knowledge? When do sacraments actually ask us to appreciate before engaging? Now, that's not true of all sacraments. You don't have to appreciate baptism to participate, right? Infant baptism. And yet, many groups are going to say, but communion's different. We want to understand. Now, there's arguments for different sides. Whether it's Orthodox churches or some Protestant churches will allow people to receive communion as long as you're baptized. So you can be a baby, a toddler even, and go up to the altar. And that's really based in this understanding of baptism, where that is your full immersion into the church life, into the community. And if you're a full member of the church, then you should have the full rights and benefits of being the ecclesia. So if you're a regenerated creature, you're born again, and that's what's done through baptism, why not be blessed some more through food, right? That food matters so much that God became food, and even children need food. But on the flip side, there's some pretty serious pronouncements. So for example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, starting around verse 20, Paul is pretty much going to warn the people from from the dangers of casually engaging in Eucharist, right? This idea that you better be like in the right spiritual state of mind. You have to do that spiritual audit, that assessment of your spiritual health, and you better be reflective, because if you approach and you are not prepared, if you are not spiritually, mentally, emotionally prepared, Paul's going to go a step further and say, you drink condemnation on yourself. You drink judgment on yourself. So all of a sudden, a sacrament that is supposed to bless you, all of a sudden has the power to curse you, right? A sacrament can curse someone if they're not doing it in a respectful manner. I think that's can be pretty jarring. It's very serious. I mean, I even went through a phase where that terrified me so much I didn't receive for a while. I'm over that now. But what if we thought about that more before we approached? We also have other points, such as in the Gospel of Matthew in chapter 5, where really you should not go to the altar unless you are first reconciled with your neighbor. If you have a grudge, right? Any grudges, you have a grudge with your classmate, you have a grudge with your parent, you have a grudge with your teacher, you got to sort it out. You got to sort it out. You have to hug it out. I mean, pre-COVID times, it's basically asking you to hug the last person you would ever want to hug. And that is the prerequisite for receiving such blessing. And this is actually why liturgically we exchange the peace right before Eucharist. This is how crucial this concept is, that we are truly piecing it out before we go out. So I wonder what it would look like, what churches would look like if more people took that seriously. Because right, we're human. And so we have this interesting, almost like cyclical, almost conflicting understanding that you have to be in this mindset in order to receive grace. But quite frankly, sometimes the people who need grace the most are the ones who are struggling to get in that mindset in the first place. So sometimes it is really that chicken or the egg scenario. You have to be strong in order to receive strength. The people who need strength are the ones who are feeling, anemic and weak and deficient. And so it kind of just coexists. And sometimes that's why it takes a lot of personal discernment and reflection. We can't just have a religious authority tell us exactly what to do. We have to do a lot of that faith work ourselves and really nurture that relationship with God, and take those faith-filled decisions. And it's another one of those things that, we receive Eucharist so that with the hope, with the reality that we become more holy, and consuming God, we are literally becoming more holy. And then at the same time, just because I or someone else might receive it more than another person, I should never think that I'm therefore better than that person. So you do it to be better, but don't ever think you're better than someone else, right? It's just another one of those kind of mysterious wisdoms. But we do it again and again because we need practice being holy, right? Like, this is about cultivating habits, cultivating our minds to focus. And the more we do something, the more it's going to become natural to us. The more we're nice to people, the more we'll actually become a nice person. And I almost like to think about it like as this dress rehearsal, that Eucharist is not only a foretaste of heaven, but we're doing this holy drama where we're kind of gearing up, we're practicing the motions of what it means to be community. That as we share a meal, we are called to we're called to practice sharing in general. We're called to, be with one another and forgive one another in this moment where we think about how Christ shed blood to forgive us. So there's something kind of really awing, awesome about the whole experience, and that every time we experience it, we might focus on a little bit of a different aspect, but over time it can all culminate and accumulate and just enrich the many ways we can access God, right? Like God isn't one-dimensional. And so we're just going to keep encountering God in surprising ways, even through the same liturgical action. Even in the sameness, it can always be different. So that was really just that kind of quick conversation. We really talked about how Eucharist might feel different in one type of church space versus another, how it might feel different when all of our high school Fenwick is gathered in the auditorium versus in smaller groups in our school's chapel, when the space looks more like a traditional church, focusing on church as brick and mortar, versus when it's in some sort of space that's considered secular. All of a sudden church becomes the people. It focuses on church as people. So there's, honestly, endless ways we could go with this conversation, but I'm going to just leave it here and invite you to think about how different actions, different objects, different foods could affect the way you encounter Jesus. Take care.